right, my AP literature friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition, with another student-facing writing workshop. And up my sleeve, I got for you FRQ 2 from the 2023 exam, set 2, featuring the Rock Eaters. And this is one of my favorite FRQ 2s of all time. My students were pretty pumped when they came back from the exam site, having been fed this. So definitely an intriguing piece. So as promised, what I'm going to do is make videos dating all the way back from 2015 to the present moment, going over FRQ 1, 2, and 3 for AP Literature and AP Lang. So I've been teaching both courses for over 2 decades now. So I got a good handle on things, and I feel like I want to share my knowledge and especially my writing heuristics. So what I'm going to do is quote unquote paint the entire essay with and for you. So I'll show you how to wield my heuristics of the declarative and inverted thesis for the introductory paragraphs. Body paragraphs, we always use the syllogistic method heuristic, and then I'll show you a couple of my favorite sentence stems. And at the end of the presentation, you should have a full understanding and knack for how to put this together. So let's jump right in and take a look at our prompt. So this, as I said, is very intriguing. So it says, the following excerpt is from Brenda Pinato's short story, The Rock Eaters, published in 2021. In this passage, the narrator is one of a group of people who left their home country after developing the ability to fly, the ability that is accepted as realistically possible within the story. Years later, the group returns to that country with their children. Read the passage carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Pinato uses literary elements and techniques to convey the narrator's complex experience of this return home. And I ask my students this question all the time with prompts. I said, based on the language of that prompt, what kind of literary elements, techniques, or devices can we assume are going to be very presently manifest in this short story? And most of my astute students said juxtaposition. The narrator is going to stand in opposition to the other characters in the book, kind of be this standalone, think alone, independent thinker. So juxtaposition is pretty evident from that prompt. So one of the things that I really train my students on is reading prompts so that they can go hunting for the terms, the devices, techniques through the diction of the prompt. And that's one that I immediately get from that prompt. So we start with a blank canvas, right? We're going to Bob Ross our instruction here, blank canvas, and we have to ask ourselves the following question. Scratch our heads and say, so how do I write the introductory paragraph? So speaking of that Bob Ross guy, let me talk about him. So many of you are familiar with the joy of painting and Bob Ross himself. And you know that he always painted with and for his students. So like I air quote this, I'm going to paint with you. And the kicker with Bob Ross is that he always used a heuristic, which is called the wet on wet technique. So literally every single time he painted in a natural landscape, it was the wet on wet technique. Quite literally, every time I engage within the expository modes, and I'm talking literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, even research, I use these 3 heuristics that I'm going to show you during this presentation without fail. So you can uniformly use these heuristics across the expository modes and especially for your entire AP literature exam. So I'll paint with and for you and demystify the whole process. But in saying that, I got some breaking news. In fact, it's top secret news that if the college board knew I was going to tell you, they would arrest me. No, just joking. It's really, I think a lot of teachers know this, but I'll give you this top secret little information, the key to the door of everything. Implicit in FRQ1 and FRQ2 prompts, and you can go back to the 70s to prove my statements here. In those prompts are implicit 2 questions. The first question is, what is the author's intent? And the last one is, how does the author construct meaning? If students answer those two questions in their introductory paragraph, you're pretty much guaranteeing yourself the thesis point. If, of course, you've ascertained the meaning of the text correctly, it's totally contingent upon how well you read. So if you answer both of those questions, you're going to be pretty good in the hood as far as getting the thesis point. But I want you to do more than that. I want you to be in contention for the elusive unicorn point, that pesky sophistication point. So here's what we do. For literary analysis, and again, you can do this for FRQ1 and FRQ2, and in fact, you can do it for FRQ3 if you want to keep things really simple. You can, my friends, invert the thesis. And when you invert the thesis, you end with the thesis. My introductory paragraphs are always 4 sentences long. So let's go back to those two questions. What is the author's intent? You lead with that question, and it's going to be 3 sentences you take to answer that. Some teachers refer to it as universal truth, universal theme, exigence, the truthiness of the passage, whatever you want. I call it authorial intent. So the first 3 sentences are going to be authorial intent. Whenever you answer the question, how does the author construct meaning, that constitutes and comprises the thesis statement. That is going to be your 4th sentence. All right. So 3 sentences for authorial intent, 1 sentence construction of meaning, in that order. There's other things you got to do. You got to wield some tier 2 level vocabulary, because this is an academic paper, and by tier 2 I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. Right? I run an intensive word study academy all academic year with my students, so I see them, the kids that give me an iota of effort, really augment their vocabs exponentially over the course of the year. There is a seismic vocabulary void, and some of you students are like, yep, my vocab's small. Work it, develop some exercises and get into some disciplined habits to help you grow and mature in terms of your diction. The other thing I want my students to focus on are their sentence constructs. My kids go through my Nuance Academy, and we study Strunk and White's Write It Right. They have something called rule number 18, in which they espouse the idea that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. And then in addition to that, there's 20 patterns that you can use for those 12 sentence types. So my students, again, if they're working with me and give me the effort, they become veritable syntactical ninjas. So at sentence level, they're able to do some pretty crafty things, and I'll model how to do that here in my exemplars, in my samples. So let's recap that. 3 plus 1, 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. So what I'll do here in exemplar 1 is I'll read it, and then I'll unpack it for you and explain how I'm manipulating my inverted heuristic. So here it is. In many regards, one's life is ultimately governed by the majority principle. Similar to lemmings, man will invariably throw himself over the proverbial cliff into a pool of mass conformity just in order to fit in, so as not to be an individualistic outlier. And a compelling force that leads one to blindly follow is the collective sense that the grass is greener on the other side, which it never is. All right, I'm 3 sentences in. You can see there, that's the truthiness, that's the pithiness, that's the substance of the whole piece, right? So the universal truth, the exigence. 4th sentence, I have to drop the most salient, relevant, germane, pertinent terms that construct the meaning. Usually I focus on 2. Sometimes if it's a really crafty piece, I'll go 3. But usually I focus on the 2 most important ones that ultimately are responsible for the construction of meaning. So look how I drop those terms, devices, techniques here. Brenda Peinado arrives at these sentiments in her short story, The Rock Eaters, primarily through a generational contrast, so that's juxtaposition, as well as her syntactical manipulation of plural pronouns. So I got juxtaposition, and syntax. Pretty crafty. 3+1, right? You can see my vocab is up. I got some really good vocab in there. Invariably, lemmings, proverbial. Like that's what I mean by tier 2. My sentence constructs are pretty crafty as well. One little thing that I tell my students is this: don't parallel your syntax. Pay attention to the sentence that you just dropped and don't repeat the pattern, because repetition creates that droning rhythm of da 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 da. And young, struggling, emerging writers, typically what they do is over rely on independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences. So students, pay attention to how often you're using that construct. It precludes you from achieving any musicality in your voice, your rhythm, your flow, if you're dropping the same construct over and over and over again. So you might be scratching your chin saying, that's really hard, Kristian. So let's do it again. Let's paint another one. Here's Exemplar II. Again, we're going to go 3+1 in the inverted thesis heuristic. Oftentimes, man unknowingly consents to being blindfolded as he traverses this thing called life. As such, he blindly complies and follows the masses without so much as a second thought. Right? That's the main thing in this. That's the universal truth, the exigence, is that sense of conformity. This is often the case when collections of people cease to water the proverbial grass upon which they stand and instead search for greener pastures. Fourth sentence, hit me with the terms, the devices, the techniques. Here it is. Thesis statement. Brenda Peinato explores this phenomenon in her short story, The Rock Eaters, through a generational binary as well as her employment of plural pronouns. So in reading this, I think those are the two most important things. I know students could argue for other terms, devices, techniques that are equally as important, but for these first two exemplars, I'm going that direction. So as you can see here, vocab up, sentence structures are supple and flowing. There's good voice rhythm flow in this introduction, and in both examples, I unequivocally have earned myself the thesis point, and I think I'm putting myself in contention for the sophistication point as well. If I can sustain this for the duration of my paper, read the passage correctly, I'm good in the hood. So students, yes, you can do this. I know it looks hard, but some practice, you can do it. So let's demystify it even further by looking at it 3 times. And teachers that are watching, I always model 3 times. I think 3 is the magic number. It really helps elucidate things for students after they see things 3 times. Here's number 3. For some individuals, they look upon the well-trodden path and immediately assume that the new trails they blaze will be a ginormous improvement. History knows of many such societies of people who errantly subscribe to this notion. Simply put, new paradigms of doing things do not always supersede old and long-standing traditional ways of life. Brenda Peinato allegorically arrives at such an understanding in her short story, The Rock Eaters. So just switched it up there to show you that, you're not exclusively housed to juxtaposition and syntax. I'm going allegory in this next one, in the third exemplar. So very cool. That's how you do 3+1. So students, give it a whirl. This is a good place to pause. Give the old 3+1 inverted thesis heuristic a try. Show each other your work, and let's see how you do. Still plenty of blank canvas left. Question becomes, so how do I write the body paragraphs? You guessed it, kids, syllogistic method. So comes from Aristotle. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Townsboys would go to Aristotle's school called the Lyceum to learn about polemic, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And if you're familiar with like introductory philosophical texts, you're familiar with Plato's Republic, in which they have the essential question, what is justice? So the scholars, the think tankers, the philosophers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. Aristotle noted that the really good orators were doing something mathematical, something calculative, almost computatively outlining or delineating their arguments. And one day he had a eureka moment and he said, I got it. There's a heuristic in this, and it's called the syllogistic method. And all it is this: going mathematically through your logic, premise, conclusion. We, in the world of composition, talk about line of reasoning, and Aristotle referred to this as cogency. So if I'm going to give you a syllogism, let me start by this. Premise 1, arsenic is deadly. You'll say, yup, Kristian, that is true. Premise 2, if I were to articulate to you, my dog ate arsenic, you're naturally going to conclude, because it's logic, it's reasoning, that's not going to bode well for your dog, Kristian. Your dog's most likely going to die. And we would call that cogency. We would call that a tight line of reasoning. So how do we take that heuristic and morph it into something that helps us do literary analysis? So FRQ 1 and FRQ 2. First premise is going to be an argument containing terms, devices, techniques. This is going to be a 3-sentence move. I like it when my students keep the centrality of their argument. All too often in samples that I read from the College Board, kids get regurgitating the text and they get way too plot summative and sounding like Cliff Note summation. Up in sentence 1, 2, and 3, the centrality of the argument is central. You have to do that. So I always say take 3 sentences to get that argument situated, and I'll model how to do that in just a second. 4th sentence begins the second premise, and this is going to take the form of textual support. We are going to want to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. And then the big kicker, my friends, body paragraphs need to be concluded, right? You just can't run like heck and abandon your, body paragraph on a quote or a paraphrase. You got to wrap it all up. And it's the link, the echo, the promise back to the prompt, the thesis, and the first premise. And my friends, students, you might be asking, how many sentences is this going to take? How many sentences does a syllogistic paragraph contain? And the answer is this: 10 to 12, right? So big, substantive, substantial body paragraphs where you're actually fleshing out the argument with good support and good analysis. So let's take a look at what a first premise looks like. I am not a fan of sentence stems. I'm not a fan of, students using templates that front load all their verbiage, all their words, and stifle their thinking for them. But I know some students get to this point of the essay and they ask themselves, where do I begin? And the answer is very simple. You begin where peinato begins. So a simple transition into the first body paragraph could be this: right from the onset, comma. So if you want to stay organized and indicate to your reader that you have a chronology, you have a sequence, you have a method that's going to be highly organized, you're going to keep your line of reasoning intact, steal those first 4 words right from the onset, comma, or write something closely akin. The best way to proceed through a poem or a short story is to go chronologically. Start where the author starts. Now, I'm going to take 3 sentences, listen for my terms, devices, techniques. I may even imply them. So check this out. Right from the onset, the narrator exonerates herself from the collective short-sightedness by placing heavy emphasis on plural pronouns. Syntax. The decades that separate the last encounters of both factions also serves as the central dichotomy that divides the old versus the new generation. Old versus new dichotomy. But of key importance is the judging diction used to describe the prodigal's homecoming. All right, so we got diction, we have dichotomy, we have syntax. So you might be asking yourself, Kristian, what am I supposed to do after that? That makes sense, but what do I do next? It's simple. You got to go textual support hunting. So we dropped in our promise of the first premise, right? You gotta keep in mind it's a promise. We need quotes and or paraphrases that look at the syntax, the dichotomy, and the diction. So I usually go get all my quotes, all my paraphrases, so that I can keep the promise of the first premise. If I keep the promise of the first premise, I'm going to be cogent, and I'm going to have a super tight line of reasoning. So let's look at what happens in the fourth sentence, which begins the second premise. So I usually get quoting and paraphrasing right away. So if you look at my first premise, I said syntax, dichotomy, diction. So I should go get a syntax quote and or paraphrase because I said syntax first, right? Order matters in composition. Logic matters. So check this out. Immediately, Penato parallels a long succession of sentences that begin with the we pronoun. All right, cool. Syntax. It is important that we were the first generation to leave our island country and that we were the ones who developed a distinct float to our walk on the day we came of age. All right, so let's talk about a couple of things here. When I quote, I do something called the 5-word rule, and it's sort of a heuristic within the heuristic. If you take 5 words, a minimum of 5 words, and place it before your quote, bracket as necessary, it should sound conversational and be beautifully embedded. You don't want abrupt quote transitions, and you want everything to be silky smooth. So that 5-word rule tends to work like 9 out of 10 times for kids, right? So give that a whirl as you're trying to embed your quotes. So you quote, you got to analyze, right? You just can't run like heck from your quote. So unpack that thing there. We're talking about syntax still. The narrator did not act alone, which to her sense of rationalization makes the decision less burdensome to carry. Clearly, this newer generation thought that they collectively held something over the heads of the old traditional cultural norms. Now I'm into the dichotomy because I'm talking about old and new, right? So early in the story, this sentiment is captured in that the we went about their lives somersaulting with the clouds, all while jackknifing confidently with their air of superiority. But immediately upon their homecoming, the airborne prodigals realized the peace they'd broken by returning is palpable and that their present is like a suspect stench. This return home makes them realize something that seems to have eluded them. What they did is nothing less than an act of betrayal. Cool. I got syntax quotes and or paraphrases. I have dichotomy quotes and or paraphrases, and by virtue of the second premise, I immediately get diction out of the way because I'm quoting and I'm paraphrasing. I'm analyzing the language. I quote, I analyze. So diction. I promised you 3 things in the first premise. Check, check, check. I did it all. But we still are not done. So check this out. I ran out of space there, so I'm going to continue on to the next slide. While the prodigals initially recoiled at how little the place fit them anymore, they find that they had to beg to be let back into the good graces of the people they abandoned. A sense of regret seems to permeate the narrator's sentiment. She distances herself from the collective we and finds a comfortable solace and appreciation when they begin to reminisce about their shared past. Those things she turned her back on, like how to eat cajolitas, Solomon, and acarilos. I don't know how to say those words, and I apologize. I speak French, are what actually bind them together. So we still are not done, right? This is going a little on the long side. I know I'm just modeling, I'm demonstrating, but let me show you how I would slap a conclusion onto this body paragraph. We still have to conclude the thought and get back to the thesis and the prompt. So just look at this. It usually takes like 1 or 2 sentences to wrap things up. Well-trodden paths are well-trodden for a reason. The lives who left their mark and built their legacies are to be cherished, not looked at with an air of judging disdain. And, I went over the 12 sentence mark by 2 sentences, totally fine. I tell my students you can break the rules a little bit. You don't want to get carried away and like bloviate on and on and on. And you don't want to be too short because then you don't have enough support and analysis. But breaking the rules a little bit is totally cool. I stayed cogent. My line of reasoning was intact from start to finish. And that, my friends, is how you do a full syllogism, right? So if you're writing with me, probably a good place to pause. Try your hand at that first premise. Go quote hunting. Embed your quotes with the 5-word rule. Make sure you slap a conclusion on the paragraph. But we are an intro and one body in. We ain't done. You have to ask yourself the question, what do I do next? And the answer is simple, and it might surprise you. You bust out another syllogism. It's a 4-paragraph essay. So intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So we're at about the middle of the passage, right? So we still have the middle and the end to do. Switch up the terms, the devices, techniques. It's okay. Like, for example, the syntax is huge in this. So I probably still need to talk about that in the remaining. The dichotomy is huge. So I still probably got to talk about that. But there's other bit parts that I haven't really given voice to yet. So in the second body paragraph, I need to cover what's left and what remains. So a 3-sentence first premise, go quote hunting, embed the quotes and slap a conclusion on it, all 10 to 12 sentences. So students, I'm going to let you have your, try your hand at that all on your lonesomes. And ask your teacher just to look over your shoulder as you write, or team up with some buddies that are competent writers and look at each other's work. So let's wrap this essay up. We still need a conclusion paragraph because, like I said, it's 4 paragraphs. So intro, 2 bodies done. Let's look at some conclusion stems. So early in the year, I'm totally cool with my students using conclusion stems, but come time at the exam, like if you're running out of time and you're running out of brain stamina, then just use a stem. It's not the most authentic thing to do. You're not going to get any originality points most likely for doing it, but you got to conclude. And usually I liken the conclusion to the grand finale of a fireworks display. Big exigence at the end, big theme, big universal truth. So stems that, kind of encapsulate the whole overarching message, like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, in a global sense, those get the gears spinning. And I usually take 3 to 4 sentences to wrap up that conclusion paragraph. That's all I need, 3 to 4 sentences. So that is the whole essay. And I am out of here, kids. Happy teaching, happy writing. Note that if you want to get in touch with me for anything, want me to look over your shoulder, or you just want to drop me an email, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com is the best way to get in touch with me. I'm also a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, present for NCTE, the College Board Perfection Learning, during the course of the year. I have a website with my calendar of events, teachinghowtowrite.com. There are some free resources on there, so you can stay abreast of my comings and goings. And for students, I own my own tutoring company that I call Write at Ivy Write. I've helped thousands of students write their college personal statements and get into really good schools, their reach schools. I used to work at Brown in admissions. I did my graduate degrees there, so I'm very familiar with what it takes to get into rigorous institutions and the type of writing that you're going to need in those personal statements and supplements. So if you want any help with that, just drop me an email and we'll talk shop. I also do a lot of tutoring for AP Lit and AP Lang. So just give me a holler and we will talk about what your needs are and whether or not I'm a good fit. So that's it from here. So as I said, I'll be doing videos going back to 2015 to the present moment. Stay tuned and watch them all and tell all your friends and colleagues about what I'm doing, and please subscribe. Spread the good word. Take care.